longer than most of you have been alive, because I started on the third floor in the gymnasium, or the fourth floor, which is the Krause Pavilion Rickles Gymnasium, and I used to do single services up there for many years, for like 12 or 13 years before they moved me downstairs. And I was the rabbi here, and started Atid, I don't know, 20-some years ago, because at the time, strangely, there were no young Jewish professional organizations in Los Angeles. And I had come from New York where there was one, and I thought we should start one here. So it is wonderful to see how that has proliferated through the Jewish world. And I thought in the teaching that I did, which a couple of you were in before, I talked about God and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Ashkenazim and Sfardim. And I'm happy to talk about that if you have any questions about it. But I thought today, instead, I would talk for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll just have questions and answers. I would talk in particular about the Jewish concept of relationships. And the reason I'm going to do that is because not just it's a relevant, obviously, topic for people at any age, but especially for people who are younger, but also, yeah, the door's closed. Nobody can leave now. That's it. You're locked in. That's the first rule of relationship. There's no escape. The second reason is that on Yom Kippur in the afternoon, I don't know if you know this, but in ancient times, people would go out into the fields to meet their mates. That's what Yom Kippur was about. And it was the same reason that people meet in the hall today, which is everybody was there on Yom Kippur, including of all ages. And so women would go out and men would go out into the fields, and they would meet, and some of them would get betrothed, and they would promise, in the next year that they would get married. And it was always a time when people met each other, and still is on the high holidays. So that's kind of a beautiful idea. And the other reason that I wanted to talk about it is most people come to services late on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Shabbat and every other time. And so you might not get the Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah because you might come later than they read the Torah portion. But it is about Abraham and Sarah and Ishmael and Isaac. And it's about both relationships and parents and children's relationships. And the first mention of love, here's a good trivia question. What's the first mention of love in the Torah? Anyone know? Well, you can ask later on, you can ask someone else, right? The first mention of love in the Torah is actually a parent for a child, not a man and a woman. The first mention is when God says to Abraham in tomorrow's Torah portion, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Right? It never says that Adam and Eve love each other. It doesn't even say Sarah and Abraham do, although it's clear that they do, because when God in chapter 12 of Genesis says to Abraham, go, that's the beginning of the Jewish people, he says in Hebrew, lech lecha, which is singular. Lecha is singular, right? Lachem is plural. There's a you singular and a you plural in Hebrew, unlike English, which is in English very confusing, right? I say you to all of you, and I say you to one of you. But in Hebrew, he says, lecha, you go, but he goes with Sarah, because Sarah is part of who he is. And then later, of course, when they go to Egypt, he says, I know how beautiful you are, like you're going to be in trouble there, so I'm going to say you're my sister, which is, by the way, not the best strategy, but it's one that's used 3 times, 2 times by Abraham and 1 by Isaac. But anyway, that's a separate question. Nonetheless, love in the Jewish tradition is not just love of man and woman, as it is in general. There are lots and lots of different kinds of love. But what characterizes love in Judaism, unlike the way we use it, is love in the English language, by and large, is an internal emotion, right? I love this cereal, I love you. It's how I feel about something. But in the Jewish tradition, as I read it, love is really an enacted emotion. If you treat somebody terribly, you can't say you love them. You may feel strongly about them, but you don't love them. I actually remember the first time I realized this was when I first became a rabbi. I'll actually tell you the story. For me, it was very illuminating and is worth repeating for other reasons. It was the first time that I was a rabbi and a woman came to me who was being abused by her husband. And like, I had no idea what to say to her, and I really didn't want to get it wrong. And I said to her, like, why are you still with him? And she said, because he loves me. And I thought, no, he doesn't. He might have very strong feelings about you, but he doesn't love you if he treats you that way. And I remember calling a psychiatrist as soon as she left my office in the synagogue and saying, like, what do I need to know? Because she told me she wants to come back, and I need to know what to say to her. This got very heavy all of a sudden. Sorry about that, but it just occurred to me. And he said, what you need to know is nothing you say will make the difference. He said, it's not like you can say a right thing or a wrong thing. She will only leave him when she's ready to leave him, and not because the rabbi said you should. So one of the things that also told me was, you know, people will come to you for advice, but that doesn't mean that because you give them advice, they will then go and do what you told them to do. In fact, I was just speaking in Toronto, and this couple came up to me and said, "You don't remember us, do you?" And they were right. And they said, 20 some years ago, we were debating whether our kids should get married in Toronto or in LA. The kids wanted to get married in LA, and we wanted them to come back to Toronto. And we came to you for advice, and you said, let them get married in LA. And I said, and what happened? They said, they got married in Toronto. And I said, and are they happy? They said, yes, they're very happy. I said, good, I'm glad, and I was young and stupid. But so you never know, but nonetheless, but it did teach me that like this idea of love is really very different from what we often use as love. And if you look through the Tanakh, through the Hebrew Bible, you do get that sense that in fact, when love is used, it's love that is really supposed to be in one way or another, both a love in action as well as a love in feeling, which is precisely why God says, this child whom you love, and now I'm going to ask you to do the worst possible thing, but I know you love him. So that's what makes this test a real test, is would you do this or not? And whether Abraham should have done it is a really good question that we can talk about afterwards if you want. But that's the first thing that I wanted to say about relationships. And then the second thing that I wanted to say was that the other really interesting thing about biblical characters that might not have struck you if you haven't thought about it this way is they're almost never physically described. We don't know what any of them look like. And in fact, when they are described, it's counterintuitive. That is, the ones who are big and strong and described as such are Goliath. You remember what happens to him. Like David kills him. He's the Philistine giant. Saul, who is an unsuccessful king, is a head taller than anyone else in Israel. And the third one is, just lost him. God, someone else who will come to me in a moment. And all three of them are unsuccessful. Oh, Samson, that's who. Who's also described as super strong and is, I don't know if you remember the story of Samson, but basically Samson is an idiot. Really, like I'm not kidding. Samson is, what happens is Delilah, he goes out, first of all, he keeps going out with Philistine women, which since the Philistines are the sworn enemy of Israel, it's not just like, oh, you're going out with someone who isn't Jewish. It's like you're going out with someone who wants to kill all the Jews. But he does this again and again. Delilah is not the first Philistine woman he goes out with. And she keeps saying to him, what's the secret of your strength? And he keeps lying to her. And every time he lies to her, like he says, if you bind me with this kind of rope. And so she does. And then says, the Philistines are on you. He breaks the rope and she says, oh, you lied to me. So she basically nags him into telling her the truth, right? It's not even that she seduces him, she nags him. It's like finally he goes, okay, it's my hair. And then, by the way, here's another good piece of trivia, is ask someone who cuts Samson's hair. And 9 out of 10 people, probably 99 out of 100, will tell you Delilah. But she doesn't. She hires a barber. Really. A barber comes in and cuts Samson's hair. And then, of course, the Philistines take him and they blind him. And only in the last minute does God restore his strength and he brings the temple down on the Philistines. But the point is, when someone in the Bible is described as physically imposing, it's to let you know that physically imposing people are not necessarily the admirable people. And that's also different from like Greek heroes. Greek heroes are all supposed to be strong and beautiful and all these attributes that we think of. And because we are so deeply visual a society, Instagram, that is a sort of countercultural message about relationships that people should hear. Just think about how differently you know someone once you get to know them. And someone's physical appearance actually changes as you get to know them, as opposed to your first impression of them, because once you know someone's inside, it changes their outside. That's the second thing I wanted to say about relationships. First about love, and second about appearance. And I'm going to make one more comment, and then I'll take any questions or whatever that you have. And the third is the whole idea of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is, and my favorite example of this, I'm just noticing that my robe is torn. I guess I've had this for a lot of years. So there's something like nice about your robe being torn. It means like it's very well used. You know, it's seen a lot of Yom Kippurs, this robe. The other is that the nature of relationship in the Jewish tradition is that, you remember Jacob. I'm going to retell you the story of Jacob, but just very briefly to get to one thing. So Jacob steals the birthright from his brother, right? He steals him by sort of coercing him, but he really does steal it. And the way we know he's really stolen it is he then fools his old blind father, Isaac, to give him the birthright. And he wouldn't have had to fool him had he legitimately gotten it, right? He would have said, Esau sold it to me, now you can just bless me. But instead he pretends to be Esau. And Isaac says to him, who are you? Who is this? And he says, Esau, right? So he lies about who he is, and then he gets the birthright, and then Esau finds out about it and says, I'm going to kill you, and Isaac runs away. I'm skipping a lot of stuff, but I'm getting to the essence of it. Then the way we get the name Israel is the night before he finds out that Esau is coming with 400 men, obviously to kill him, because you don't bring 400 men to say hello. He wrestles with this angel, and the dawn is breaking, and the angel says, let me go before the dawn breaks, because apparently angels, like vampires, are not supposed to be around during the daylight. And Jacob says, I'll let you go if you bless me. And the angel says to him, you're no longer called Jacob, now you're called Israel, because you have struggled with or wrestled with humans and divine and survived, okay? And wrestling with God is what Israel means. But if you think about it, that's a very, very strange blessing. Because I have to tell you, as a rabbi, I've been asked for blessings lots of times, and what do people want to be blessed with? Health, success, children, peace. Nobody ever says, my name is Sydney, I'd like to be called Fred, right? That's not a blessing. But you understand that what the angel is saying is, you can change who you were, because Jacob was not a good person, right? He stole that blessing. He lied about who he was. And the first thing the angel says to him is, what is your name? And he says, Jacob, because the angel wants to know, will he tell the truth this time? And once he says Jacob, he says, no longer, now your name is Israel. So the other thing about being in a relationship is that it allows you a chance, depending on who you are, who it is that you are with, to be different than you are. Because a lot of us think that we are who we are because of our parents. But really, if you think about your life, your peers are as influential and sometimes more influential than your parents are. And who you choose to be in relationship with and who you choose as your friends is going to say a lot about who you are. And I can give you a really easy heuristic to remember this. There was a book written years ago by a woman named Judith Rich Harris. I think it was called The Nurture Assumption or The Nurture Something. And she asked the following question. She said, children of immigrants, who do they learn their language from? Like, if you immigrate to the United States and you have children, who teaches them English? Their parents do. He said, but even though the parents teach the language, the kids grow up without an accent. Why is that? Because evolutionarily, you are programmed to speak like your peers, not like your parents. Right? I mean, if you have children, for example, in their teens or 20s, you didn't say like every other word because that's not how you were trained. Why do they do that? Because that's how their peers speak. So all of us are, in a deep sense, more socialized by our peer group than we are by our parents. And therefore, the third rule of relationship, to go with the first two, is who you are in relationship with will shape you, not just you shaping them, right? Everybody goes into a relationship thinking, I will now change this person to accommodate me. But in fact, it is mutual. You change the person, they change you. It's a feedback loop. So you want to choose people who will make you better. You don't want to choose people who will only make you comfortable or even only make you happy. You want to choose people who will make you better. Also because long run, if you don't feel that you're getting better in that relationship, you won't be happy. So those are my, we've got, I don't know if we can, yeah, I was going to say the kids in the truck may not, they may be a little too young for this. They were like, so let me stop there and ask questions, comments about any of the stuff that I talked about. What were the first two? For those of you who came in later. Okay, so the first two were, first of all, that love is an enacted emotion. Love is not just what you feel, it's what you do with what you feel. And if someone treats you badly and says they love you, they're wrong. They're either lying or they're mistaken. Because if you think of it this way, if you say, I'm compassionate towards you, as you're hitting someone, you would say, you're not being compassionate towards me. And yet somehow, strangely, we accept the idea that someone loves you when they mistreat you, and that's equally wrong, as to say. So you can feel very, very deeply about someone. You can be obsessed with someone. If you don't treat them well, you don't love them. Because to love someone, you only asked me for repetition, but now I'm going to go. To love someone is actually to care about how they feel. Iris Murdoch, who was an Irish novelist and philosopher, said, love is the extremely difficult recognition that someone else is real. Do you know how you know you are real, but it's really hard to believe that other people are real? Because, like, you know they act like they're real, but to feel your way into someone else, you really have to love them. And so if somebody treats you in a way that makes you miserable and they say they love you, you can say, you feel really strongly about me, but you don't love me, or you wouldn't treat me this way. It's like that anecdote that I actually just put on these, like one of these little videos about a rabbi who said he learned about love from two men in a bar. What the rabbi was doing in the bar, I don't know, but still. I'm sure he was like going there to help people. But he said he saw two people who were drunk and were talking to each other, and one of them said, do you love me? And the other one goes, we've been friends our whole lives, of course I love you. And he goes, well, you know what hurts me? And the other one goes, no, how could I know what hurts you? And he says, if you don't know what hurts me, how can you say you love me? And so the rabbi said, I always thought that loving someone meant you knew what made them happy, and now I understand that loving someone is understanding what hurts them. And it's the same idea. So the first is that love is an enacted emotion, and the second is that in the Bible particularly, someone's appearance is the least important thing about them. We don't know what Abraham looked like. We don't know what Sarah looked like. We don't know what any of the biblical heroes looked like. And the ones that we do know, those were the kids in the truck. The ones that we do know are always, they're always the ones who are upended. And the three examples that I gave were Goliath, Saul, and Samson, right? Like being big and strong, not the criteria for being lovable or good. So those were the three. Okay, questions, comments, anything? About Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Judaism, Israel, anything you want. Doesn't have to be about relationships or love. Yeah.
Yeah, so my we go through sharing with love when there's so much hate being put towards many podcasts and the response
Well, okay, so first of all, first you remember that most of the people who react are the people who feel negatively about something, right? And also, it depends how high the bar, a lot of this is social media and algorithms, but it also depends how high the bar is. Because I know when I put a post up on Facebook or on X about Israel, what will happen is, so you'll get 1,000 likes and 20 negative comments. And all you hear are the negative comments. It's just, I have to tell you, the same thing happens, just so you should know this, when a rabbi gives a sermon. Rabbi, that was wonderful. Rabbi, that was wonderful. Rabbi, that was wonderful. Rabbi, that wasn't one of your best. And when you go home, what do you think about? Why wasn't that one of my best? So we are, and that's evolutionarily how we're programmed. Because if you walk by a fruit tree and you don't see it, you're okay. You walk by a tiger and you don't see it, you're dead. So we pay much more attention to negative stimulation than positive stimulation. And the media, which you shouldn't blame, they're just doing their job, which is to make money, and you make money by getting people to tune in, and people will tune in to negative stories, right? If you put, something bad happened, everybody will pay attention. If you say, today, no incident at Sinai Temple, no one's going to read that story. And I know I did this thing when I was at Harvard last year. I did this public dialogue with Steven Pinker. And Pinker, who's older, said, when I was in college, all anybody talked about was the Vietnam War. Every single day, the Vietnam War. He said, tomorrow, I promise, none of you will wake up to a headline that says 60 years of no war in Vietnam. Because the good, which is data, doesn't make the news. The bad, which is anecdote, is what makes news. So first of all, know that for yourself, because it will give you a certain peace of mind. It's like most people who are going to react negatively. Most people who approve of what you do won't react. Which is why, by the way, one of the things I always say to Jewish audiences, and I don't know, you're not an audience, but is when someone stands up for Israel or for the Jewish people in public, try to thank them. Try to find their email and thank them, because people will find their email and write them, how could you say that terrible stuff, you jerk? But they also need to know that people appreciate what they say. And then I don't think you have to react with love to somebody who is hateful. I just think you have to react with equanimity, which is not the same as love. And the reason I say that is, first of all, shouting at someone never changed anyone's mind. Calling someone an idiot never got someone to say, oh, you're right, I actually might be an idiot. I never thought of that. Until you pointed that out to me, I was not clear, now I have to rethink my position. But when you're in a dialogue with someone, especially if they radically disagree with you, the best thing you can say to them, really, the best thing you can say is, tell me more. Tell me more. Explain to me why you feel that way. Because if someone doesn't feel like you're listening to them, there's no way that they're going to listen to you. And the only chance you have is to give them the sense that you're actually interested in how they got to where they got. And how they got to where they got actually matters. Because it might be when you say, tell me more, that they don't have any more to tell. So then you know they got there because everyone else is saying it. Or they might say, because I read this, and then you have some sense of why they feel the way they do. And when you present counter stuff, just remember, like all of us have heard things that don't land until years later. And the Jewish, I sometimes give the example of, like in football, you always throw the ball ahead of the receiver because you want people to catch up to it. But the nice Jewish way of expressing the same thing is in the Shema, it says that these words should be on your heart. And the Kotzker Rebbe once said they're supposed to be in your heart. So why does it say to put them on your heart? And his answer is that hearts aren't always open. So you have to put them on your heart, and then when your heart is open, maybe the words will sink in. So it's the same thing. I know there are a lot of things that I did or believe that if you had asked me years ago, I would say, no, I don't agree with that, or I don't believe that, or whatever. Let me give you like one really easy metric. If you go back 30 years, you couldn't find almost anyone, 40 years, anyone who believed gay marriage was okay. Like, the most liberal, tolerant people would say, well, that's crazy. Everyone knows that's crazy. And now, virtually everyone, almost no matter how socially conservative they are, says that's okay. So don't believe that opinions can't change. They really can. You just have to, like, restrain the most difficult thing, which is reactivity. Like, it's, you know, you don't want to be triggered. Yeah, Josh.
So I don't know exactly how to form this question, but
So, first of all, yes, I think this is a historic shift in the history of the Jewish people. That I grew up in what was basically the post-Holocaust age. And we are now, I don't know what it's going to be called, but we are now in the post-Holocaust age. October 7th marked a break. But I don't know yet what that break is. None of us know yet what that break is, because it's still clearly in formation. A lot of it has to do with what's going to happen in the Middle East. And we don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East. I don't know what's happening right now in the Middle East, literally, you know. I don't know if Israel is going to counterattack in Iran, or how they're going to do that, or what that's going to mean, any of this. I don't know what the election is going to mean to Israel. There's a lot that is still unformed. And the one thing that I do know is that the reality of the persistence of anti-Jewish hatred is no longer capable of being denied or ignored. Because, look, I want to tell you, and I'm not, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not exactly the same thing. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're really close. There's a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram. Because if I said to you, look, I really wish they would just wipe France off the map, but I don't really have any negative feelings towards French people. You would say that's ridiculous, right? And when you say that about the only country in the history of the world that has been run by Jews, and it happens to be a group that for thousands of years has had a historical hatred, to say, I wish that one country out of the 200 countries of the world wouldn't exist, but I have no hatred for them, it doesn't make any sense, right? It makes no sense. It's like saying Pakistan, which, by the way, was also formed in a colonial sense, but for Muslims, and entailed much, much more death than the formation of Israel. If somebody said today Pakistan shouldn't exist, of course you would call them anti-Muslim. So that's why I say, like, I mean, is it conceivable to be anti-Zionist without being yes, it is conceivable. But as you point out, all of the Torah is about getting to Israel. And if you pray our prayers, we pray about Jerusalem and Israel all the time, and all of our holidays, and next year in Jerusalem. I mean, it's like they're so intertwined as to be inseparable. Yeah.
Along the same lines, after the Holocaust, 10, 20 years, Jews were absorbed. Will in 10 years again be possible that we will again trust that we will be welcome, absorbed, and that we'll be able to move forward?
So it depends. It depends which country. Some countries, I mean, America is the best at this. I really do mean that. And there's a reason, by the way, why America has been better for Jews than other countries. There are actually, I'm going to give you two reasons. The first reason is why America is the luckiest country in the world to start with. And it's not because of the Constitution, and it's not because of George Washington. It's because of the following: Canada, Mexico, ocean, right? We are the most buffered country, certainly great country, in the history of the world. I mean, go look at a map of Russia. Why do they feel threatened? Well, they have enemies on their border. Go look at the Middle East. Go look at Europe. Why do they have all those wars? And in America, it's like, what is our great invasion? Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor is not Cleveland, So, yes, we've had a civil war. And yes, we had skirmishes in the past with Mexico and Canada, but we're incredibly lucky. And the other reason that it's been so good for Jews is throughout Jewish history, we have been the identified other. There were Russians and Jews. There were Iranians and Jews. There were Frenchmen and Jews, but there aren't Americans and Jews. America is so many different groups that there isn't one group that says, the Jews are not like all the rest of us. We aren't like all the rest of us. And because of that, I think it is very possible that Jews will regain their footing in America in a way that does not seem possible now. And also, I just sort of believe that, from a certain sense of faith, that Israel is basically right in this conflict, which does not mean, with all the caveats, that Israel hasn't done terrible things and so on, just like America has done truly terrible things. But ultimately, when we criticize Israel or America, we're criticizing it with the principles that the country stands for. Just like when you criticize the Torah, you criticize it with the principles of the Torah. And so I think that it is possible, but it's still part of the evolving story, and we'll see. We will see. 1, 2, yeah.
So I think there's a flip side.
No question about it.
Involvement, less observant.
Absolutely.
People aren't raising their kids Jewish,
Right.
and even if they say, okay, I'm really committed to this, more and more Jews
That is inherent in every instance in Jewish history that we know of, starting with Alexandria, Egypt, where they had a Jewish community, and in Germany. As people become more acculturated, Judaism gets weaker, and the reason that it does is because it's countercultural. You have to be very different from the people around you, and that's hard. And that is the great question of the survival of non-literalist Judaism. And by non-literalist, I mean everything from modern Orthodox on is, can that survive in a culture where you're accepted? Because, as you said, like the great joke it used to be, we would say, don't kill us. Now we would say, don't marry us. And that's a big change. So, that is exactly the great I would say, look, in terms of Jewish survival, assimilation is a much greater threat than anti-Semitism. In fact, and then I'll take this question, Dara Horn, whom some of you may know, wrote the book People Love Dead Jews, which is a great book. She makes a distinction between two different kinds of anti-Semitism. There's Purim anti-Semitism and Hanukkah anti-Semitism. Purim anti-Semitism is, oh, that was loud. Purim anti-Semitism is we want to kill all the Jews. That's what Haman wanted to do, right? We know that. That's Haman, Hitler, that's Purim anti-Semitism. Hanukkah anti-Semitism was about Jews becoming Greeks. It's not about Jews being killed. It's about Jews not being who you are. And she was on the Harvard Anti-Semitism Committee with me. She used to say in the meetings, what we're seeing on campus is Hanukkah anti-Semitism. That is, as long as Jews don't like Israel, we're fine with them. And so the threat of assimilation is a much greater, in terms of Jewish survival in the diaspora, certainly a much greater threat. Then, yeah. Yeah.
But like for the younger generations who are just why we should appreciate and value Israel and protect it.
Right.
Be proud that we're Jews, and all they see is this hate towards Jews when they're still like developing their why we should respond and be like, this is wrong, this is why it's okay, good and whatever to be Jewish.
Absolutely. I think that a strong presence on social media, I mean, it's the reason why I do all these podcasts and so on, and why I encourage people who are really good at it, and especially people who are younger, to be on TikTok and Instagram and so on. And I think it's fantastic. But I'm also aware of the fact that, first of all, a lot of money has been poured into anti-Israel influencers, and we're talking about from an unlimited supply, which is places like Qatar, which have a virtually unlimited supply of money, and that it's a really hard fight. But yes, I think that it is great. I'm not sure in the end that the war will be won or lost. The war of influence will be won or lost on TikTok, but I may be wrong, because the other part of this is we're conducting this vast social experiment that has never been done before. You know, I mean, during COVID, I remember thinking that this was the first time in history that the entire world was going through the same thing and knew that the entire world was going through the same thing because of social media. Otherwise, I mean, we could have been going through a global pandemic, but nobody knows what's going on the other side of the world, but now we do. So this is gigantic and unprecedented. And if you had said, when I was a kid, I don't know if you know this, but when I was a kid, we all thought we would be flying around on jetpacks. Like that was going to be the future, right? But if you had said, no, actually what you will do is carry all of human knowledge in your pocket, we would have said, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You can't do that. So we're very bad at predicting the future. We really don't know what's going to happen. And I don't know whether, first of all, social media can be changed in any way, because it's really new. And while I don't, I mean, I'm not making heroes out of the people who created social media, but I also recognize that they also couldn't really possibly predict the effect of what they're doing long term, just like we can't. And by the way, just before I take the question, AI may change all of this in ways, again, that we can't possibly imagine, and is already starting to, like deep fakes and companies that are against deep fakes, and on and on and on. It's like, it's gigantic. So yeah. Oh, yes.
Oh, I wanted to go back to the conversation you were having about love being an act of emotion.
Sure. Oh, no, not at all. Right. So, I mean, first of all, what you're asking for someone, if you draw a line in the sand, is you're asking them to enact their love, right? If you're saying this thing that you do makes me unhappy, and they're doing it not for a principled reason, but out of habit, for example, then you're saying, I want you to enact your love in this case. It's hard. Sympathy, I mean, it's such a case-by-case basis. There are some things you can do. There's a famous, like Deborah Tannen, who is a linguist, talks about the different ways that men and women talk. Now, she wrote books a while ago. I don't know if she could still write that book today because now you're not supposed to essentialize. But nonetheless, she used to tell this anecdote about how she would say, men always talk for solutions, like, what do I do? And women talk for sympathy. She said, and she gave this talk once, and someone, after listening to it, that night, their wife said, I'm really thirsty, could you get me a glass of water? And the husband said, you know, before I heard the talk, I would have gone and gotten you a glass of water, but now I understand that you're just trying to express the deep sense of thirst, so I want you to know that I sympathize with that. And so it really depends on what it is. I mean, you have to have a combination of, but also then you run into the how much will you change for another person, and the answer is that you can't completely overhaul who you are because you'll go back to baseline and then the person and you will both be disappointed. So you have to have a realistic sense of who you are and want someone to fall in love with who you are and not their projection of who you are. But within those lines of reality, we all accommodate each other in relationships and have to. Otherwise, you know. And also, and we accommodate each other not only by the way we act, but by what we say and what we don't say. Because think of all the things you've thought about people you love that if you said would not be helpful to the relationship, right? So all relationships are a negotiation with the world. That's just the way it is, yeah. And then. Actually, love of God is mentioned a couple of times, and it doesn't say, the love of God in some ways is analogized to people because idolatry is compared to adultery, right? You're going after other gods. And that's actually explicit in one of the prophets, but I won't go into it at the moment. So in some ways it's similar in that it's supposed to be a reciprocal relationship. I suppose that you can only carry that analogy so far because it depends. Like if you have a relationship with a child, the child is dependent on you. So in that sense, we're the children in this relationship, and we're dependent on God, but God is not analogous exactly to a Jewish parent, even though we use a lot of parental imagery in there. So I wonder whether someone has done an extensive comparison of discussion of love of God and love in particular. I will say the one thing about, you know, God sometimes, the definition of a prophet is someone who stands between God and the people. That's what Moses does. When God gets angry at the people, Moses pleads the people's case, and when the people want to betray God, Moses pleads God's place. He's an intercessor, sort of. So it's a really interesting question and deserves more time than unfortunately we have to give it. Yeah.
Kind of on this topic and also bringing it back to the how do we make those things now?
So the Akedah, which is the binding of Isaac, is a unique event in Jewish history, and it has a billion different interpretations. One of them is that God is really testing Abraham, and that Abraham fails the test by being willing to do it. Because after all, after that, interestingly, Abraham and God never speak again, and Abraham and Isaac never speak again. That's at least one interpretation. The other is that the whole point is, what God is saying is, I want the same level of devotion as pagan gods that have people sacrifice their children, but I don't want that sacrifice. And so once you've proved to me that you have that level of devotion, know that I would never ask that sort of sacrifice, because Abraham doesn't know God that well. God's new to Abraham. But there are endless Akedah explanations. Yeah, sorry, we're out of time. But there are endless Akedah explanations. But in the end, obviously, that is supposed to be a one-off. And the only other time in the Torah where someone is said to sacrifice a child is with Yiftach, and the rabbis condemn him for it, even though it's never said perfectly explicitly that he does. So I will say this, though. What we do in prayer is remember that there used to be sacrifice in the temple. And that was really a powerful emotional experience to see an animal sacrificed on the altar that you had raised from the time it was born. And prayer, it's hard to get the level of emotional investment in prayer that sacrifice used to bring. And so that's part of our sort of task, is to try to feel without that kind of, it's the rabbis call it sacrifice of the heart. Prayer is avodah shebalev, sacrifice of the heart. Really difficult to get that level of fervency without actual sacrifice, but that at least is what we are supposed to do. And with that, although I would love to continue, I have to abandon you to prayer. So thank you all for coming. And if you have any other questions, you should feel free, seriously, to email me. I'm more than happy to answer other questions. And everybody at Sinai, by the way, has the same email, just in case you ever want to. It's their first initial, D, last name, Wolpe, and then it's at SinaiTemple.org. dwolpe at SinaiTemple.org, or anyone else. Yes? Okay, great. Thank you.